Jonathan Pollard is a criminal. He committed a very, very serious crime. He was convicted of one count of attempting to commit espionage, for which the longest sentence recorded in the United States until him was 6 years. The simple question is whether or not the punishment fit the crime and whether or not he has an opportunity to petition for his own parole, for his own pardon, for his own commutation of sentence. The U.S. Court of Appeals in Washington said that his lawyers could not even see the file, although they have the highest security clearance granted in the United States. They can't even see the file, so they can't even truly make a petition themselves for commutation of sentence because, frankly, any of Jonathan Pollard's opponents can simply make up a story about what he did.
It is time for the President to take a cool, analytical look at this matter with an eye towards justice. That's what our judicial system is designed to do, to achieve justice. And that is why we ask for the President to grant clemency to Mr. Pollard.
I'm, I think, the only member of Congress who has seen the full file, and I can tell you this: anyone who is talking doesn't know, and anyone who knows isn't talking. So what this comes down to is not the made-up stories about what Jonathan Pollard did or did not do. It's whether or not the penalty fits the crime.
I visited Jonathan Pollard in the federal prison in North Carolina in 1998, and convinced to this day that his incarceration since 1985 is enough already. There's no question that of his guilt. He didn't question his guilt, in fact. In passing classified information to Israel. Our letter, as Barney has pointed out, stresses that fact. We're not questioning Mr. Pollard's guilt, but rather appealing for clemency based on the vast disparity between his sentence and his crime. And you've all seen evidence of who was convicted of spying, and then the charges and the conviction and then the punishment. It is a stark contrast, believe me, chapter and verse.
I am not among the people who says his crime was okay because he spied for an ally. It wasn't. It was a serious crime. And I don't want anyone who views this proceeding or who reads this letter to think that all of us on that letter believe that somehow it's less of a crime to spy for an ally. It's not. He took an oath and he violated it. He did do a serious thing. But what we're saying is that compared to other people who did serious things, no one in the history of the United States who did something similar to Jonathan Pollard serving a life sentence, and nor should he.
I will never forget that visit in '98 when I was led into that federal prison, praying that I would never have to go to that prison ever. When I saw, spent an hour and a half with Mr. Pollard in the prison library with no supervision, and an interesting chat about his family, what they've endured, as well as what he had endured up until that point. And of course, he was confined and continued to be confined after I left the prison.
You can see that this was a case of ineptitude by his lawyers. They didn't even file for an appeal at the time the sentence came down. They didn't ask for an evidentiary hearing when the Secretary of Defense said this was the worst case in the year of the spy. They didn't ask for an evidentiary hearing. Terrible lawyers. You could say that this was a classic case of an arrogant, stupid defendant telling the trial judge he doesn't recognize his authority, violating his own agreement not to talk to reporters. No doubt about it. But when you scrape away everything else, what this comes down to, as Mr. Frank and Mr. Pasquale have said, is at what point does the penalty no longer fit the crime? At what point, out of a sense of compassion and common sense, do we say, you know what, to say to someone who cooperated fully, someone who was offered a plea bargain, that if you cooperate fully, we're going to recommend leniency to the court? At what point do you say that enough is enough? 25 years later, to have Jonathan Pollard still be in jail is simply not fair. It simply doesn't fit the crime that was committed.
Israel is one of our strongest allies, no question about it. In 25 years behind bars is far too many for Mr. Pollard. Those of us who signed on to this letter believe. Especially considering the sentences to those convicted of similar crimes. I will repeat, please look at those sentences. You know what I'm talking about. The view is shared, the view I specifically just communicated is shared by many respected figures in the defense and intelligence community.
My own view is that the justification of this is the humanitarian one, and the notion that the American justice system should be a fair one, and we believe that clemency after 25 years from the offense of Jonathan Pollard will do that. My own hope is that if the President were to do this, it would contribute to the political climate within the democracy of Israel to enhance a peace process. There are clearly people in Israel who are concerned about the nature of the Israeli-American relationship, and who in particular feel that if there ought to be steps going forward, an affirmation of the strength of that relationship is important. We know previously that this is something President Clinton had contemplated doing in the context of a peace negotiation. He was deterred from doing it by some of the people in the law enforcement community.